Thank you for joining me today in drawing a flower. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's start by drawing a loose circle with our pencil to create guidelines to where we want our flower to be on our paper. Then we're going to do a slightly curved line down to indicate where we want our stem to be. We're going to draw a little circle in the middle, and the little lines around it will be the direction of where we're going to place our shadows. Let's get creative and draw our petals. Starting with the top left, create a wavy and imperfect line up and around to draw our first petal. You can be as creative as you want. These are just guidelines, so play around with it. This looks good. Let's go ahead and draw our second petal. This petal will be a bigger one, and it'll sit in front of another petal. We will continue to use the circle as a guideline to the shape of how the flower will become. This next petal is going to be a huge one that sits behind the one that we just drew. The top and the bottom lines show us how big the petals will be. From here, I'll get creative and add wavy lines to show the outline of this petal. Here you can already see the flower is taking shape. These arrows indicate the direction of the pen when I start to create shadows. Adding a curved line creates movement. Now for this last petal down here, I'm going to create a triangle shape. This area in there will be very dark as that petal turns in towards the flower. Following the curve of the original circle, get creative and add the type of shapes and waves and movement that you want this petal to be. With my mad skills of video creating, I drew our next step out of view of the camera. But essentially, I am drawing part of the petal that will be folded over, and it's in shape of a wavy, wonky triangle. Anyway, back to finishing this petal. Up at the top, we will draw a soft curve that goes out a bit before it snakes back to connect the line beside it. And finishing the first part of our drawing by adding a curved line for our stem. Moving on to pen and ink, I will be using a Precise Pen V5 RT. I use this a lot when I do ink sketches because the thickness and smoothness of the pen makes it easier for shading in detail. We will start with the darkest place on the flower, which is the little triangle. This is part of the petal that goes back to attach the stem. So I want to indicate the weight and the darkness of that area. I like to make all my lines go in one direction first, then draw another set of lines on top of those, going in a slightly different direction. This technique is called cross-hatching. Next, we're going to continue by outlining the edges of this petal. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect. Nothing in nature is perfect. These arrows will help indicate which direction I want the shadows to go, and with upward ink strokes, I start to make my shadows come out from where the triangle is out towards the outside of our object. I like to start from the darkest point and draw my shading outwards. And then as I go farther out, I use lighter pressure with my pen. Lighter pressure with the ink pen will create a softer shadow that connects the light and dark part of the spaces of that shape. I'm creating thickness and weight and shadow by going over that same spot with the pen till I got the desired look. And then moving up, connecting the outline of that petal. Moving to this upper petal right here, I'm going to get creative and not follow exactly the outline that I made before, but making my shape more defined in the direction that I really want it to look. Coming back to our center circle and following the lines of our arrows, let's start to add our shadows. Going from the middle of the circle outwards. I'm going in one direction and then slightly changing that direction to create a crosshatch effect, and in that way darken the shadows. You're going to do this technique all the way down. And once you get the shading lines around the circle finished, you can start to create the next part of the shading. These long lines help to create movement along the petal, as well as define the shapes. Here you won't need to use as many lines because these are not pushed back into shadow. These lines that are starting from the outside in also help to create where the curve and the wave of our petals are, giving us that visual illusion. Moving on to our next petal. Let's again begin by creating our borderline, making this pretty dark and thick. Then once again, starting with the darkest part of this section, I'm going to go from the middle of the circle outwards, following the direction of those arrows. Pushing the pin down pretty firmly at this point because I want to get a good shadow. And then once again, changing direction. Remember, this is called cross hatching. It's a wonderful technique to use when you're using pen and ink. Then coming to the outside of the petals, again, I am putting several lines around the wavy area. That'll give me the shape of the petals and the direction and movement. Not too many though. I want to push this part of the petal back behind the flower petal that is to the left, so I'm going to add a lot of ink strokes, and that'll push that back and behind the shape beside it. We're going to move to the bottom part of that petal. It sits behind the one in front of it. So again, let's start with our first step by creating a thick borderline to define the edges and to show us where our shadows will start. bringing that wavy line up to connect. And then starting my shading. Notice how thick and dark these pen strokes are when they are closer to the other shape. That'll help the petal get pushed back behind, creating depth to your picture. And then using a lighter pressure on the outside to create a softer look. Take your time. Really enjoy the process. So here on this petal, I'm going to do a line that cuts into that right point. That wavy line will give me the front of the petal, whereas the line above it is the petal kind of curving back on itself. Since this is the outside of the petal, I want to give that indication, and so I will take those lines and take them from the top all the way to the bottom. Here I'm going to push this part of the petal back behind the front of it by adding pen ink strokes going in one direction and then switching directions. That way I'm creating the illusion of shadow. Moving on to the last petal, we will use all the techniques that we have been using on the other ones, starting with, you guessed it, the outline. Here I'm adding a little bit of shadow to create movement and interest in the drawing. I'm trying to make these lines look as organic and natural as I can. Perfection is not the goal when it comes to drawing nature. This area down here will be underneath the bigger part of the petal, so be sure to add a good bit of shading here, but leave some white on the right side because that's where the light will hit it. Starting with very firm pressure with my pen, and as I progress I get lighter and lighter pressure, and that helps the transition between shadow and light. want to push this part of the petal back underneath. So I'm going to add shadow right here. I love using curved lines. This helps give shape and form to the space. Here I'm using medium to light pressure with my pen. And again, switching directions to create the crosshatch look. It also is a great way to darken an area. Create more curved lines to show the movement of the flower petal. Here, I'm showing you some places that you can draw them, but feel free to add yours wherever you feel like they should be. This looks good. Like hitting that like button and subscribe button. So I'm going to stop here and move on to the center of our poppy flower. For the center, I will start with a technique called stippling. It's pretty much where you jab your pen onto your paper as fast as you can over and over again. It's quite fun, but this technique does take a long time, and it can be tedious. So we're going to add squiggly lines all around the circle. There really is no right or wrong way of creating this look. Just go with what feels right to you. Make sure you go over the same spots. Now for the stem. Draw two curved lines close to each other in a downward motion. I like to keep the line that is closest to the flower shorter. It just adds interest. Then add depth and shadow by starting to add shading near the top of the flower, creating lighter pressure as you go farther down. With all that in place, it's cleanup time. With your eraser, you're going to erase all the guidelines that were first laid for us. At this moment, I was slightly horrified to realize I forgot to add the outline of the top of the flower petal. Yes, this is where we're at. So use your creative intuition and add a wavy outline to the shape. Here I opted to use the lines on the petals as transitions for the outline. I have to admit, it does look better this way. And now it's time to finish cleaning up before the final step. And the final step, writing your signature. I hope you enjoyed drawing a poppy flower with me. I would love to hear how your drawing went. Happy creating, and I will see you next time.